The summer of 2014 was my favorite format in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And for a good reason. There were tons of decks that were viable. If you wanted to play trap-based decks, you could play Geargia or Hat or any number of rogue strategies. And if you wanted to play big monster decks, you could play Mythic Rulers or Light Sworns or Sylvans. All sorts of strategies were viable that summer, and after that, the game changed forever, and I think in some ways we'll never get back to the beauty that was the summer of 2014. And in today's video, we're going to talk about what happened and how most of what happened actually stems from the first set released under the new pendulum mechanic, which was Duelist Alliance. There are two things that I want to note before we get into the meat and potatoes of this discussion. First, you have to remember that at the NAWCQ, you still drew 6 cards going first. Now, nowadays, we only draw 5 cards going first, which seems a lot fairer. Just in the long run, going first is not as impactful as it was back then, and I really can't imagine the past couple years where the first place person actually would have drawn 6 cards. It probably would have been utterly ridiculous. So that's one huge change that happened after that event, but also I want to make the note that pendulums really did not impact the game very much. In actuality, while pendulum summoning was a very hated mechanic when it was announced, it would basically take an entire year before it made a huge impact. Yes, Clifford's, which came out in the second set of the pendulum sort of format, yes, that deck did make impacts, but that deck really wasn't a true pendulum deck. It was more of a stun strategy and really doesn't resemble the pendulum mechanic as we know it nowadays, so I'm not even really counting that one. But you have to remember that even though pendulums were hated and people complained about them a lot, pretty much every good deck that first format, once we got Duelist Alliance and the new pendulum cards, almost all of them ignored pendulum monsters entirely. One thing that's worth mentioning about why Duelist Alliance made such a big impact on the game is that it's one of the only sets in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that actually introduced not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 4 competitively viable strategies to the game, all of which were brand new. That's really, really rare in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Even some of the best sets that we think back to, like Breakers the Shadow, those types of sets that introduce a ton of powerful cards, in many of those cases, the cards are supporting themes that have already been supported throughout the past months, and that's really important when we compare Duelist Alliance to many of the other good sets in Yu-Gi-Oh, simply because not only did Duelist Alliance introduce good cards, but they were new cards that didn't really support the older strategies. If you wonder why there's such a distinct difference between the post-Duelist Alliance metagame and the pre-Duelist Alliance metagame, it's because many of the 4 distinct strategies in Duelist Alliance not only power crept older strategies, but also in a lot of cases just replace them outright. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about in today's video. So I'd like to go through each of those 4 archetypes and talk about specifically which decks or which style of cards those strategies then power crept or replaced entirely, so we can kind of take a look and figure out why Duelist Alliance actually changed the metagame so drastically and so fast. It might seem a little weird to start at Satellar Knights, but as someone who was playing the game when Duelist Alliance was first being announced, Satellar Knights were actually one of the first strategies from that set that we actually had leaked, and they made a pretty big impact, because the fact of the matter is that Satellar Knight Altair is one of the most ridiculous level 4 normal summons in the entire game, and while it has been kind of overwhelmed by the rest of the metagame in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, when it came out, it was pretty much better than any other card as a 1-card rank 4. And back then, especially pre-2014 Duelist Alliance era, there were tons of strategies that existed that simply were just rank 4 toolbox strategies. Decks like Spirits and Heraldics and Geargia and sort of Hat at some points, depending on how many Traptrix Diania they played. All these different strategies, while they did have their own unique nuances, in general, they were just trying to end on a couple rank 4s, and Satellar Knights completely power crept that just by the sheer power of Deneb into Altair. I mean, if we really think about it, if it goes uninterrupted, Deneb makes 3 rank 4s over the course of a couple turns, and that is simply way better than a lot of those older rank 4 strategies, which meant anytime you were trying to play a deck where the main goal was making rank 4s, you then had to ask yourself, is there any reason I'm playing this over Satellar Knights? And in many cases, there simply wasn't, especially considering that Satellar Knights had the awesome counter trap card, Satellar Nova Alpha, which was a hugely important piece piece of that strategy to actually make sure your board didn't get broken. And in many cases, if the rank 4 strategies could compete with Satellarknights for that sort of rank 4 making, they couldn't compete with the sheer power level of their themed trap card. While it is true that they ended up being overshadowed by the TCG exclusive archetype in this set, I do want to give a nod to Yang Zings for basically being the synchro equivalent of Satellarknights in terms of power creeping a lot of the older strategies. When we look back at Yang Zings, it is kind of interesting that they weren't more popular simply because they all have floating effects. All of the non-tuners have formula synchron effects. Baxia is one of the craziest synchro monsters printed in a long time. There's all sorts of good mechanics going around in the Yang Zings, and at the end of the day, I think the only thing that really kept them from being a top contender, outside of being a good rogue deck for a couple formats, but I think what really kept them from being like the best deck of any format is that they were too normal summon reliant, and eventually they got ways to sort of circumvent that, especially when we started getting these Zephyr cards. But at least looking back at when they first came out in Duelist Alliance, they were still a solid rogue strategy simply because of how much more efficient they were at synchro summoning compared to a lot of other decks out there. So even though Yang Zings didn't power creep every strategy in existence, kind of like the other 3 of the 4 themes introduced in the set, I still did want to mention them simply because they did see play, albeit not a lot when Duelist Alliance was first revealed. How could I talk about Duelist Alliance without mentioning the most hype strategy from the entire pack, Shaddolls? And it might seem funny looking back on it now with hindsight, but El Shaddol Construct really wasn't what people were looking towards when they thought Shaddolls were going to be one of the best strategies. In fact, many people were way more afraid of El Shaddol Winda controlling their decks rather than El Shaddol Construct just OTKing them directly, and a lot of people hadn't really made the connection with Super Polymerization being one of the best ways to actually push for damage in that strategy. So many of the early builds of Shaddolls were just really silly looking, and the deck didn't see a ton of play or success until Patrick Hoban won YCS Toronto with it, with that Light Sworn variant that really hinged on the use of Soul Charge and the little Chaos Dragons and Light Sworns and Shaddol Fusion, and it just had so many big cards that it could play that it really overshadowed many of the early versions of Shaddolls. But yeah, it's funny looking back on it because Window really isn't that important of a card. It's not a bad card, but really what made Shaddolls good was the repeated use of El Shaddol Construct and Shaddol Fusion, and that really hurt a lot of the strategies I was talking about when we were talking about Satellarknights, because many of those early rank 4 strategies that were so popular at the end of the summer of 2014 before Duelist Alliance came out, pretty much none of them could deal with a repeated Shaddol Fusion, because it wasn't just enough that your opponent got a ton of graveyard effects with Shaddol Fusion, and it wasn't just enough that they built a huge board. The biggest issue is that if you didn't make Abyss Dweller before killing the fusion monster, they just could add back the Shaddol Fusion and do it again next turn. Now, this might not sound that good in the context of modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but one of the main popular themes from Duelist Alliance was this floating ability. So Satellarknights don't technically float. I mean, their Exceed monster does, but the main deck monsters don't. But pretty much all of the other strategies in this set that I'm talking about did. Yang Zings got more Yang Zings when they were destroyed. Shaddolls floated when they were sent to the graveyard. Burning Abyss floated when they were sent to the graveyard. And all of this floating, and many times it wasn't really paired with powerful on-field effects, especially in the case of Burning Abyss, but all of this floating really helped a lot of these strategies beat the older ones, because many older strategies, while they did have a lot of good card economy exchanges, they just simply didn't have the staying power of decks like Shaddolls and like decks like Burning Abyss, which meant that all these new decks could just outlast these older strategies, which really came up a lot back then, because Yu-Gi-Oh really isn't a game so much about OTKs. Even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh that doesn't happen too often, but back then it was a lot slower than it is right now, and if you could just outlast your opponent, a lot of times you would just win that match. Speaking of outlasting your opponent, let's talk about Burning Abyss. Now, I just mentioned a couple minutes ago that Burning Abyss really weren't hyped when they were first revealed, and that's absolutely true. It seems really silly looking back on it now and saying, well, of course Burning Abyss was a good deck. They had triple Dante, triple Seer, triple Skarm, triple Graph, but also they had triple Tour Guide and triple Mathematician, all sorts of cards that are now limited on the Forbidden and Limited list. Actually, everything from what I just mentioned, the only cards that weren't hit were Dante and Skarm. All those other cards are either currently on the list or were on the list for some time, and that really makes a big difference, because when we look at the old 2014 format after Duelist Alliance, it's really worth mentioning that Burning Abyss really weren't built correctly, very similar to the Shaddoll deck that I just talked about, because people just didn't know what to do. They didn't figure out that just lasting forever was actually a win condition, because that's what Burning Abyss do, and a lot of people were splashing Monarchs in them when they first came out because they saw that they were like free tribute fodder. I myself did like the same thing back then, and we saw Supply Squad in a lot of those early builds. People really didn't figure out how to play the strategy until Jeff Jones got first place at ARG Indy with this crazy 20 monster, 20 trap Burning Abyss list, and that kind of started what a lot of people eventually figured out was the best build of that deck, at least until new challengers when they got a whole bunch of new support like Fire Lake. But just looking at the Duelist Alliance format, we can see that Burning Abyss looks very different from what we now know as a deck. It pretty much was all trap cards and monster cards, almost no spell cards, and the trap cards they were playing were all things that were discarding. You saw a lot of Wing Blasts, you saw a lot of Karma Cut, things that could get the Burning Abyss monsters out of your hand, and because there weren't as many Burning Abyss main deck monsters as there are nowadays, and because there wasn't Beatrice or even Virgil, the Burning Abyss monster was kind of just a small monster deck that just kept going and going and going, which made it really difficult to deal with. Now, I could technically say that the Burning Abyss strategy did sort of like in the case of Satellar Knights, that they did like power creep and replace all the rank 3 strategies, but by the time that 2014 came around, especially the summer of it, there really weren't a lot of those. I think some of the early rank 3 strategies were like Inzectors and Windups, but we didn't really see a lot of those until Burning Abyss, or at least in between Burning Abyss and that format in like 2012. So I can't really say that because there weren't a lot of them being played. But even today, I mean, Burning Abyss compared to all these other strategies, and the Shaddoll comparison's a little unfair because we don't have Construct, but Burning Abyss has like 6 cards hit on the Forbidden and Unlimited list, and it still is winning events. I mean, it literally just won the UK National Tournament, which is a pretty big deal considering this deck is almost 5 years old. Anyway, though, that pretty much wraps up my discussion on Duelist Alliance. You can look at these 4 themes and see that they made a huge impact on old decks, and eventually they made an impact on how newer strategies were built. But I also wanted to mention one last time that the reason that Duelist Alliance was so impactful was simply because this set sort of power crept everything. It made every other deck have to compare themselves to these 4 strategies, and in many cases the older decks simply could not compete. Now, this was like the whole purpose of Duelist Alliance. If you notice, the 4 strategies that I talked about all sort of revitalized one mechanic. In Satellar Knight's case, it revitalized rank 4s. In Burning Abyss case, it was rank 3s. In Yang Zing's case, it was Synchros. And in Shaddoll's case, it was fusion summoning. All these things were meant to reinvent those different types of summoning mechanics, and that is kind of cool, but yeah, it power crept a lot of the decks that were using those mechanics that simply couldn't compete with these new strategies. It's also worth mentioning, just as one final note, that this was the first set where Konami implemented the whole give us 2 TCG exclusives in every single pack and then sort of support the themes for 4 sets. That was all started in Duelist Alliance. Prior to this, we did just see basically 10 random support cards for any card in the set. We hadn't really seen a lot of fully fledged TCG archetypes that didn't take like 5 years to fully get, just like Noble Knights did, which I think is kind of interesting now that we kind of know that as like a staple every single year, to expect that Konami is going to give us 2 fully fledged TCG exclusive archetypes. Anyway, though, thank you so much for watching this video. It's been a long time coming, like a really, really long time coming. I keep mentioning this video, but I now finally did it, so I can move on to a bigger project, and I hope you guys really enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.